Our gospel reading for this morning comes from the 13th chapter of Matthew as we enter into several weeks where we hear Jesus teaching in parables about the meaning of the kingdom. Listen to what the Spirit would say to us this day. That same day, Jesus went out of the house and sat down beside the sea. Such great crowds gathered around him that he got into a boat and sat there, while the whole crowd stood on the beach. And he told them many things in parables, saying, "Listen, a sower went out to sow. And as he sowed, some seeds fell on the path, and the birds came and ate them up. Other seeds fell on rocky ground, where they did not have much soil. And they sprang up quickly, since they had no depth of soil. But when the sun rose, they were scorched. And since they had no root, they withered away. Other seeds fell among thorns, and the thorns grew up and choked them. Other seeds fell on good soil and brought forth grain, some 100-fold, some 60, and some 30. Let anyone with ears listen." And then we skip over some of the other material and come to the place where Jesus is privately with his disciples explaining the parable. Hear then the parable of the sower. When anyone hears the word of the kingdom and does not understand it, the evil one comes and snatches away what is sown in the heart. This is what was sown on the path. As for what was sown on the rocky ground, this is the one who hears the word and immediately receives it with joy. Yet such a person has no root, but endures only for a while, and when trouble or persecution arises on account of the word, that person immediately falls away. As for what is sown among the thorns, this is the one who hears the word, but the cares of the world and the lure of wealth choke the word, and it yields nothing. But as for what is sown on good soil, this is the one who hears the word and understands it, who indeed bears fruit and yields in one case 100-fold, in another 60, in another 30. The word of the Lord. A sower went out to sow. He scattered seed rather indiscriminately, and it went everywhere. It went on the hardened path. It went into the thorns and the brambles. It went into the rocky soil where nothing ever grows. When I put grass seed out on my yard, sometimes a little bit gets on the sidewalk. A few seed may get into flower beds, and other places they don't belong, but for the most part, I try to keep the seed in the yard where it does belong. I don't want to waste good seed. But the sower in Jesus' parable seems unconcerned with such waste. As parables go, this one is fairly well known. It is one of those few parables that is found in all four of the Gospels. And to my ear, it's not all that hard to understand. I'm not sure we even needed the explanation that accompanies it. It's true to life. The message of Jesus is out there, but it doesn't take everywhere. And sometimes even when it does take, it doesn't last. We've all seen it. We all know people who grew up in the church but want nothing to do with it as adults. We've seen people join the church and get very involved and then gradually begin to slip away, finally disappearing altogether. We've seen other priorities take over: work, hobbies, youth soccer. Even though most of us know absolutely nothing about the agricultural practices of the first century Middle East, we can still follow along with this parable and nod our heads saying, yes, yes, that's very much how it is, Jesus. But when we're done nodding, what more is there? Does this parable have anything to say to us, to teach us? Now, the people who first heard this parable came from very different backgrounds than us. And I'm not talking about the fact that they're much more familiar with farming than we are. Rather, I'm talking about the fact of their experience as this Jesus movement as a small, very marginalized affair. The very early church was an all-Jewish operation. And yet, these first Christians had a great deal of difficulty getting more than a very tiny minority of their fellow Jews to join them. And by the time Matthew writes his gospel, they are beginning to welcome in Gentiles to the church, but those Jewish Christians, the majority, are increasingly faced with a difficult choice. They are being forced out of many of the synagogues. They still consider themselves Jewish. They still want to participate at synagogue and be a part of the faith and worship traditions they have been a part of since they were children. But the leaders of the synagogue are saying to them they can do that only if they stop saying Jesus is Lord. This parable is spoken to people who are struggling to understand why things are the way they are. Why aren't more people joining? And what's going to happen if more and more believers deny Jesus so they will maintain their welcome at their home synagogue? Now, by contrast, we American Christians have long been a huge majority. But the decline of many churches in the 21st century may be giving us a small taste of what it must have been like to be Matthew's congregation all those years ago. And as we move deeper and deeper into what some are calling a post-Christian world, I think we might do well to hear this parable more with the ears of those who first heard it. Now, one thing this parable does not do is explain to us why the gospel bears fruit in some and not in others. It does not explain the mystery of why some soil is good and some is not. But it does paint us a picture of what faithful discipleship looks like. When we compare what happens in the different sorts of soil, an image of discipleship emerges that is marked by understanding, by perseverance, and by a single-minded focus on the work of God's coming kingdom. This is not a I'm a Christian because my parents were Christian sort of faith. It is a faith that knows and understands the message of the faith. It is a faith that perseveres, that stays focused and committed even in the face of persecutions and temptation. Now, we American Christians know next to nothing about persecution, but we are more than familiar with temptations. The temptations to do something other than follow Jesus are everywhere. And they surely have grown much more numerous in the last 50 years or so. I once read a book entitled Resident Aliens by Stanley Hauerwas and William Willimon, both at the time professors at Duke Divinity School. And in the first chapter of this book, they speak of this new world of increased temptations that the church now lives in. And they suggested, half-jokingly, that this new world began one Sunday evening in 1963. On that day, one of the authors was one of 7 members of the Methodist Youth Fellowship at the Buncombe Street Church in Greenville, South Carolina. A group that had decided that on that evening they would all go into the front door of the church and then sneak out the back door of the church to join John Wayne at the Fox Theater. On that night, they write, Greenville, South Carolina, the last pocket of resistance to secularity in the Western world, served notice that they would no longer be a prop for the church. There would no longer be a free pass for the church. There would no longer be a free ride. The Fox Theater went head-to-head with the church over who would provide the worldview for the young. And on that night in 1963, the Fox Theater won the opening skirmish. Now, regardless of where one, jokingly or not, dates the beginning of this new world, our culture certainly has decided that it will no longer till and water and weed for the church. It will no longer funnel people to us so that all we need do is open our doors on Sunday morning and the pews will be filled. And when the church when the culture decided it would no longer prop us up, discipleship stopped being the easy thing we had tried to turn it into. And it once again became what Jesus understood it to be, something requiring deep understanding, real perseverance and commitment in the face of all sorts of temptations and inducements to live and act in other ways. Jesus understands discipleship to be living and working for peace in a world that prefers war and violence. Discipleship is seeing the face of Jesus in the poor and the vulnerable, in the oppressed, in a world that says, look out for number one. Discipleship is worrying about the needs of the other in a world that is worried about my rights and the advantages that my group has. Discipleship is being willing to give up and sacrifice my good for the good of the other. In a world where millionaires want and get tax breaks. Discipleship is longing for, hungering and thirsting for righteousness, for things to be as God would have them in a world that simply accepts how things are. And it is easy to look around at this world and to despair for both church and world. Who's going to want to follow Jesus in a culture where we are constantly bombarded with the message that what you really need is to be beautiful and young and rich and tan and cool and powerful and independent and secure and with instant access to endless diversions and entertainment? And how are we ever going to solve the real problems in the world when neither politicians nor voters can look beyond their short-term selfish interest to do what is best for everyone? It is indeed easy for those who hear the call of Jesus to despair, to throw up hands and say, what's the point? Why expend the energy and effort? Reasons for despair were even greater in the days when Matthew wrote his gospel. when both the religious authorities and the might of imperial Rome envisioned a very different world than the one Jesus called his followers to build. But Jesus speaks his parable of the sower directly to these difficulties that threatened to bring despair on all those who would follow him. This parable speaks of a foolishly extravagant sower who goes about throwing seed everywhere. He throws it onto rocky soil, into hardened paths and hardened hearts, in the midst of choking thorns and weeds. He throws it everywhere, not in the least bit deterred by the knowledge of the fact that most of it will never reach maturity. Because the sower knows that that seed that finds good ground will bear fruit. 30, 60, 100-fold. Jesus tells those crowds, and he tells us, that we should not be surprised when many choose not to follow him. There is much in the world that draws people away from the commitment and single-mindedness and perseverance that Jesus asks of us. But for those who do steadfastly follow, the results are spectacular. 30, 60, 100-fold. From those who work tirelessly for the kingdom, the promise of justice and peace, of hope and dignity for the poor and the vulnerable and the oppressed, the triumph of love over hate, and of a world where all have enough. All these things began to be seen in the work of these people. And if such a promise of such a world seems too much, seems foolish in the face of the way the world is, of how things are, remember this: the world, the way things are, the powers that be, were all absolutely certain that Jesus was dead and gone come Good Friday, and that he would never trouble them again. All praise and glory to God who calls us to new life and new hope in the person of the risen Jesus Christ. Thanks be to God.